Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Prince. Hope you guys are enjoying some of this time off. Just to give you guys a little heads up into what to expect over the next couple of weeks. I know I sent you a very, very long message on Schoology, and your parents and guardians were also emailed with kind of a lot of information. But what's going to happen is each week I'm going to be creating one of these videos for you guys to watch, where I am going to actually model and introduce the topic for that week. I'm going to come up with an example problem. I'm going to show you step by step how to work through that problem, so that while you start working on the actual problems from the textbook, which are in the Google Doc on Schoology, you can always refer back to this video to see how I did it on a similar problem. So this is for you to use. Hopefully you do pay attention, take any notes that you need, but the video is going to stay there. It's not going to be taken down, so you can always go back to it, access it as you need it, so that you can get a little extra help as you are working through the problems from the textbook. Another option that you guys have, if you are struggling through those problems, just shoot Mrs. Hoiser or myself a message on Schoology or an email, whatever is convenient for you. Let us know where you're struggling. So if we can help you through email or on a message on Schoology, we'll do that first. But if you're just really, really stuck, and there's a couple of you especially that are very stuck, we can schedule a Zoom chat with small groups so that we can show you a little bit more personally, go over it a little bit slower, help you out so that you can complete the assignments as needed. Now, those aren't particularly for the review and preview days. Those are the ones that I talked about for Thursday. Thursday days are the kind of homework problem days. So on the Google Drive, you'll see that down at the bottom are about 4 to 5, maybe 6 problems that are labeled review preview, which means that a lot of those problems are from previous chapters. Some of them are from the current lesson that you just completed. And some of them may even be topics that we will be covering in the upcoming weeks. Okay, so some of those might be a little more difficult for you. That's totally fine. But the way to get help on those is if you actually go into our textbook homework help, and I sent your parents in a link on how to get to that. If you go into that, it will take you step by step, give you hints if you get stuck. On some of the problems, it does bring you to the answer. Do try to do them on your own first. Otherwise, it's not really benefiting you. But that's how you'll get help on those. So the Zoom chats are primarily to help you through those Tuesday and Wednesday problems where you're working through the problems from the text. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on our first week of lessons. Now, I'm going to be using this program. I'm actually working on my iPad right now, so bear with me. It's my first time doing this. But I've taken some snapshots into a program on my iPad. I'm going to be using my Apple Pencil to be showing you the steps and talk about my thought process as I'm going through it, so that might be able to help you on your problems for tomorrow. Okay, so we are starting chapter 7. I know we were just going to be finishing chapter 6 with our test and all that. You all lucked out, and now you don't have to do that. So we're moving on to chapter 7. And chapter 7 brings us back to proportions and percents. Okay, so it says, when traveling in a car, have you ever asked, when are we going to get there? Did you know that you could use math to answer that question? In section 7.1, you will use diagrams like the ones you used for percents to find the relationship between rate, time, and distance. So we are going back to proportional relationships. So we'll go into what those look like again, but this is something that we have covered in the past. So if you have your chapter 4 notes, it might be a good idea to look back on those, especially if you have your toolkit at home, because they may help you out in this chapter. Okay. All right. So looking at our distance and time, I created a table very similar to the one you're going to see on your problems for Tuesday and Wednesday. And this one is just a hamster race. Okay, so we took a hamster, we put him down, he started running. We're assuming at a constant rate for this particular problem because of that proportional relationship. And For every 5 seconds, we measured how far the hamster had traveled. So after 5 seconds, the hamster had traveled 2.5 centimeters. After 10 seconds, the hamster had traveled 5 centimeters. After 15 seconds, the hamster had traveled 7.5 centimeters. After 20 seconds, the hamster had traveled 10 centimeters. Okay. So, what you want to notice when we have that proportional relationship is that we're going up at that constant rate, which means each time I'm going up, I'm adding the same amount. I'm adding 2.5 each time, adding 2.5, and I'm adding the same thing over here as well, okay? I'm adding plus 5, plus 5, plus 5, okay? So I have a constant change going on. Hopefully you also remember that when we're having proportional relationships, that also means I can always add an extra line into my table, which tells me at 0 seconds, I have traveled 0 centimeters. So we always need to be able to say that we can put that 0, 0 into our table. Okay. Now, the next step we want to do is we want to take this and graph it. Now, because I am super nice, on your problem for tomorrow, I have already made the graph for you, but I'm going to walk you through my graph for this particular data. Okay. So I have my hamster race. I have all my tails set up. And we know that at 5 seconds, okay, there's my 5 seconds. At my 5 seconds, the hamster traveled 2.5 centimeters. So we're going to go here to the 2, and we're going to go up about halfway. And it is between the line, but that's okay. We make our dot. At 10 seconds, so go over to the 10 seconds, we go up, and the hamster has traveled 5 centimeters. 15, we're going to go up another 2.5. So we're at 7.5 centimeters. Right about there. It's hard to tell on this small little grid. And at 20 seconds, we had traveled 10 centimeters. Okay. So what we just looked at in the table is when we said that we could already add in our 0, 0 by saying that 0 seconds, we've traveled 0 centimeters. I'm going to go ahead and add that into my graph as well. Okay, so I'm going to add that right on in there, 0, 0. And why not? Okay, so we want to take a look at our graph. Okay, the first question that you're going to be asked for the chapter is, where does your graph begin? Now, if we hadn't added that last section, you might look at this graph and say, well, my graph begins at 5, 2.5. Okay, that is my 5, 2.5. But is that really where the graph begins? Is that where my data would begin? No. So that's why we add our 0, 0. This graph begins at 0, 0. And that's a really important thing because we are proving that we have a proportional relationship. So the next part says, should your graph stop? Okay, well, technically we don't have any more room on this graph, but the question is really asking, could we add more data on, or are we assuming that this hamster is not going to continue moving after 20 seconds? It's going to get to 20 seconds and it's just going to stop dead in its tracks. Probably not going to happen. So should the graph stop? Not necessarily. We ran out of space, so we kind of had to, but we could continue this graph on if we had the space. Would it make sense to continue your graph to show how your hamster would travel if it were to continue? Not particularly, because what we notice in this graph already is that, and bear with me because I have this wobbly pencil, we have a pretty darn straight line. Okay, so should we keep adding this data on here? No, because we're going to keep going up at the same amount. The line is not all of a sudden going to change if our hamster is moving at a constant rate. So it doesn't really make sense to continue the graph any further than we have it, because we have as much information as we need. Now, what we can do with our graph is now we can look at it and we can figure out other amounts for different amounts of seconds. Okay, So if I went to, let's say, put this in here, do 12.5 seconds. Okay. And I said, how far would the hamster have traveled in 12.5 seconds? I could just plot that in there. I'm going to take this on up, see where I am on my graph. And we are a little more than 6. We're about 6.2, let's say. Okay, it's a good estimation. Okay, so after 12.5 seconds, 12.5 seconds, we know that our hamster should have traveled almost 6.2 centimeters. Okay, so this graph can give us quite a bit of information. We can estimate the distances based on the amount of seconds we're looking at. Okay. All right. Now, another question that you're going to be asked in the chapter is, does it make sense to connect your points? Now, I already connected my points. To me, it made sense. But what we're really looking at is, are we able to pull data out from these parts between my points? Does that give us any information? And we just proved that it did. Okay, when we went here to this 12.5 and went up, that wasn't at any of our actual data points, but we were able to get information based on where that line was going through our data points. So it absolutely makes sense in a proportional relationship like this to connect the dots on your graph. So you'll see, like I said, I set up the data points on your graph for your lesson this week. You're going to be asked some of these questions. Where does your graph begin? Does it make sense to continue your graph? Does it make sense to connect the dots? So you're going to look at your data for this week and see, do I have a proportional relationship? And does it make sense to connect those dots? Okay, if it's proportional, the answer is definitely going to be yes. Okay. All right, so our next point for this is finding out the unit rate. Okay.